The stones of the temple courtyard are still cold. It is early. The light comes in low and sideways across the pavement, and the dust of the court has not been stirred up yet by the traffic of the day. A man sits down on the stone. That is what a teacher did in Jerusalem when he was about to speak. He sat, and the people gathered and sat around him in a loose ring. And if you had been in the city that morning, you could have walked in off the street and joined them. No invitation, no fee. You sit on the stone with everyone else and you listen. And then you hear the footsteps. Not one set, many, fast and out of step with each other, coming from the direction of the houses. Men in good clothing, moving too quickly for men in good clothing. And in the middle of them, being pushed along, a woman. They do not bring her to the front of the circle. They put her in the center of it. She is standing on the stones in what she was wearing when they took her out of a bed. And every person seated on that pavement is now looking at her, and she is looking at nothing at all. They know the teacher's name. They call him teacher. They say she was caught in the act. They say Moses commanded that women like this should be stoned. And then they ask him the question they came to ask. What do you say? You already know what happens next, or you think you do. He kneels down. He writes something on the ground with his finger. The men leave. The woman lives. But nobody tells you what he wrote. John does not record it. 2,000 years of sermons have gone around that silence rather than through it. And there are two things about this morning that almost nobody mentions. The first is that for 400 years, men who copied the Bible by hand quietly cut this story out of the Gospel of John. They believed it. They took it out anyway. And we know why. Because one of the most famous men in church history wrote the reason down. We will get to him. The second is the way those men left the courtyard. They did not leave together. They left one at a time, oldest first, in order of age, until the youngest was standing there alone. John counted. He wrote it down that way on purpose. This is not a story about a woman's sin. This is not a story about a cruel crowd. This is not a story about being given a second chance. This is a story about a man who knelt down in the dirt of the temple and put himself inside a verse that only God could stand inside. And about the moment the oldest men in the courtyard read it and understood and walked away. He wrote two things in that dust. The second one emptied the temple. To understand what happened on that pavement, you have to back up 3 days. It was the Feast of Tabernacles, the week when the whole city moved outdoors and slept in shelters made of branches to remember 40 years in the wilderness. Every morning of that week, a priest carried a golden pitcher down to the pool of Siloam, filled it, and carried it back up through the water gate, while the crowd waved palm and willow branches and the trumpet sounded. He climbed the ramp to the altar and poured the water out. They did this for 7 days. On the 8th day, the last and greatest day of the feast, the priest circled the altar 7 times. The Mishnah in the tractate Sukkah records the rite. And into that morning, a man stood up and shouted, "If anyone is thirsty, let him come to me and drink." He said it in the temple court. He said it loud enough that John describes it as a cry. The scribes were standing there. The chief priests were standing there. They heard a carpenter's son from Nazareth stand up in the middle of the water ceremony and offer himself as the water. Hold that thought. It is the key to everything that happens 3 mornings later, and every man who will walk into that courtyard dragging a woman was standing in the crowd when it was said. Now here is what happened that same night. The temple guards had been sent to arrest him and came back empty-handed. The council demanded to know why. The guards said they had never heard a man speak like this, and while the council was still angry, one of its own members spoke up. His name was Nicodemus. He was a Pharisee and a ruler of the Jews, and he had already come to see Jesus once, at night, when nobody could see him do it. Now, in the daylight, in front of his colleagues, he asked a legal question. Does our law condemn a man before it hears him and finds out what he is doing? That is a procedural objection, and it is the most basic protection the law gives a defendant. Nicodemus was right, and every man in that room knew he was right. They did not answer him. They asked whether he was from Galilee too, and told him to go search the scriptures himself, and the meeting broke up and everyone went home. The next morning, the same men walked into the temple court with a woman. Pay attention to this, because it changes how the scene reads. These are not strangers reacting in the heat of a moment. These are men who had been told in their own council chamber the night before that condemning someone without a hearing was against their own law. They went out and did it anyway, in public, using a human being as the instrument. Now look at where they put her. John uses a specific phrase. They set her en meso, in the midst, not in front of him, in the middle. In a Jewish legal proceeding, that is where the accused stands, surrounded, with the judges and the witnesses ringed around her. They were not asking a rabbi for an opinion. They were staging a trial in his classroom and handing him the gavel, and their case had a hole in it you could walk through. They quoted Moses. They said the law commands that such women be stoned. Go read the verse they are quoting yourself. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10. It does not say the woman shall be put to death. It says both of them shall be put to death, the man and the woman. Deuteronomy says the same thing twice. So where is he? They said she was caught in the act. Caught in the act means there was a man in that room, and there were witnesses in the doorway, and those witnesses saw both faces. Under the law they were citing, he should have been standing on the pavement beside her. He is not there. He is not mentioned. Nobody in the crowd asks about him. Here is the part nobody tells you. If you had been sitting on that pavement with a copy of the law in your head, you would have seen it in 10 seconds. The case was already dead before Jesus opened his mouth. It was dead on procedure because there had been no hearing. It was dead on the letter of the statute because half the required defendants was missing. Some of the men holding stones had spent their entire lives studying exactly this, which means the trap was the point. Watch how tight it is. Rome had taken capital punishment out of Jewish hands. If Jesus said stone her, he was inciting an execution the governor had not authorized, and there were witnesses standing right there to report it. If he said let her go, he had publicly set himself above the law of Moses in the temple courtyard in front of a crowd, and that was the charge they had been trying to build against him for months. It is the same shape as the coin they would bring him later with Caesar's face on it. 2 doors, both of them locked from the outside. The men who built it were good at this. Somewhere behind it stands Caiaphas, the high priest that year, the man who would eventually explain his own arithmetic out loud. Better that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. That is the calculation being run in the courtyard that morning. 1 woman spends for 1 carpenter. So they ask the question, "What do you say?" And Jesus does not answer. He bends down. Before he straightens up again, count what is already broken. No hearing, which their own counsel was warned about the night before. No man, when the law they quoted required both. No jurisdiction, because Rome held that power. And no interest in the woman at all, from anyone standing on that pavement holding a stone. 4 things wrong, and he has not said a word yet. If you are getting something out of this, subscribe. This channel goes verse by verse through the parts of Scripture most people skim past, and there is a lot more of this coming. Now watch what happens next, because what he does with his finger is the part everyone remembers, and almost nobody explains. He kneels down and starts writing on the ground. Not a word to them, not a look. A grown man in the middle of a public interrogation, on his knees on the pavement, tracing something in the dust while the most powerful religious authorities in Jerusalem stand over him waiting. And the silence goes long. We know it goes long because John tells us they kept on asking him. That is not one question repeated politely. That is men leaning in, pressing, raising their voices because the thing they planned for is not happening and they do not know what to do with the quiet. Sit in that with them for a second. However long you are imagining it, make it longer. Long enough that the woman, who has been staring at the stones, looks up to see why nothing is happening to her yet. So what is he writing? There are 3 answers you will hear, and each one gets partway there. The first says he was writing out their sins. 1 name, 1 sin, 1 man at a time, and each man read his own line and left. It is a powerful image. It has been preached from every pulpit in the English-speaking world. The trouble is that it explains the leaving and nothing else. It does not explain why he wrote twice, or why they left in strict order of age, or why John, who gives us the exact sentence Jesus spoke out loud, refuses to give us a single letter of what he wrote in the dirt. The second says he was stalling, buying time, letting the heat come out of the moment. That one is true as far as it goes, and it goes about 6 inches. It treats the most deliberate act in the scene as filler. The third says he was writing out the law they cited, Leviticus 20 verse 10, so they would have to read the half of the verse they skipped. This is closer, and it might even be part of it. But it is still a legal correction, and what happened in that courtyard was bigger than a legal correction. Men do not abandon a public prosecution they spent the night arranging because someone pointed out a citation error. But it gets stranger, and this is where the location matters. He is on his knees in the temple court. Turn to the 17th chapter of Jeremiah and read it the way those men in the courtyard would have read it, from memory, without looking down. Verse 12 begins by talking about a glorious high throne, the place of our sanctuary, the temple, the exact ground under his hands. Then verse 13, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all that forsake thee shall be ashamed, and they that depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters. Read it slowly, because there are 3 things stacked inside one sentence. Those who turn away get written in the earth, written in the dirt. It is the only verse in the Hebrew Bible that describes God writing names into the ground, and Jeremiah spoke it standing in the temple gate. They are written there because they have forsaken the fountain of living waters. And 3 mornings before this, in this same courtyard, during the water ceremony, in front of these same men, Jesus stood up and shouted that anyone who was thirsty should come to him and drink. Now watch the Hebrew do something the English cannot. The word Jeremiah uses for hope is mikvah, and it is built on the same consonants as the word for a gathering of water. By the 1st century, a mikvah was the stone bath every one of these men walked down into before entering the temple to make themselves ceremonially clean. So in one line, Jeremiah calls God the hope of Israel and the cleansing pool of Israel, and then says the ones who walk away from that fountain get their names written in the dust. There is one more thing, and it is the detail that pulls the woman back into the center of it. Open the 5th chapter of Numbers. It describes what a priest did when a husband accused his wife of adultery with no witnesses to prove it. The priest took holy water in an earthen vessel. Then he took dust, and the text specifies where the dust came from: the floor of the tabernacle, the floor of the house of God. He put the dust in the water. He wrote out the words of the curse on a scroll, and then he blotted the writing out into the water, and the woman drank it, and the outcome was left entirely to God. Dust from the floor of God's house, writing erased, a woman accused of adultery, standing in the middle with her life hanging on it. Every element of that ritual is on the pavement that morning, and the man performing it is not a priest. By the 1st century, the ritual had already been abandoned, and the Mishnah records why in the tractate Sota. A rabbi named Yochanan ben Zakkai stopped it because adulterers had become too many. The bitter water only worked if the husband bringing the accusation was clean himself. When the accusers stopped being clean, the ritual stopped working. Hold that next to the courtyard, a woman in the middle, dust from the temple floor, a man writing in it, and a ring of accusers whose own cleanliness is about to become the only question that matters. He is still kneeling, they are still shouting, and then he stands up. He stands up and he gives them one sentence: whoever is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her. We have heard it so often that it sounds like a proverb about being nice to people. It is a ruling, and it is drawn straight out of their own statute book. Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 7. In an execution by stoning, the hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him, and afterward the hands of all the people. The witnesses throw first. That is the law. It is the safeguard against perjury, because a false witness has to become a killer with his own hands before the crowd joins in. So he leaves the sentence standing. He simply asks which of the men present is qualified to be the first hand on the stone. Under the law they walked in quoting. A man who arranged this trap, who left the other guilty party at home, who ignored his own counsel's warning about a hearing the night before, would have to step forward first, in daylight, in front of everyone sitting on that pavement, and swear by his own arm that he was clean. Then he kneels down and writes a second time. John changes the verb. The first time his Greek uses a compound, katagraphen, carrying the prefix kata, which means down, and in some settings means against. The second time John simply writes egraphen, he wrote. Two different words for two different acts. Whatever the second thing was, it was not a repetition of the first, and that is when the courtyard starts to empty. Now here is the detail this whole story turns on, the one from the very beginning. They did not leave together. John says they went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, unto the last. If Jesus had written their private sins in the dust, the leaving would have been scattered and random. Whoever spotted his own name would bolt, and a nervous young man is at least as likely to bolt as a composed old one. That is not what happened. It moved through the crowd in a clean line, by age, from the top down, which tells you exactly what he wrote. Because there is one kind of writing that a courtyard full of men would decode in strict order of age: Scripture. The Greek word John uses for the eldest is presbyteroi. It means the older men, and it is also the word for the elders of the council. These were the men who had spent 50 and 60 years memorizing the prophets. They could look at 3 or 4 words traced on a temple pavement and know instantly where they came from. The younger men in the ring were still working it out, while the old men were already turning around. And what the old men understood was worse than exposure. They read the ground. They heard in their heads the shout from 3 days earlier about living water. And they watched a man from Nazareth kneel in the dust of the sanctuary and take the position that in Jeremiah belongs to one person only. In that verse, there is a fountain of living waters, and there is a hand that writes the names of the ones who walk away from it, and both of them are the Lord. Embarrassment does not empty a courtyard in strict order of age. Recognition does. They understood who was kneeling in front of them, and they walked out rather than stay and answer it. Now for the other thread from the beginning. The men who cut this story out of their Bibles. That is documented. 2 of the oldest complete Greek manuscripts we have, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, both from the 4th century, do not contain this passage. Codex Bezi, from the 5th century, does. Some later copies mark it with symbols, or park it somewhere else in the Gospel, but the story is far older than those manuscripts. Around the year 125, Papias knew an account of a woman accused of many sins before the Lord, and Eusebius records it in his church history 2 centuries later. Jerome, writing in 415, says the passage stood in many Greek and Latin copies he had handled with his own hands, and he kept it in his translation. So why did anyone take it out? Augustine answers that directly, around the year 419, in a book about adulterous marriages. He writes that certain men of weak faith removed it from their copies because they were afraid their wives would read it and conclude that adultery carried no penalty. Read that again. It was cut because it worked. Men held a scroll in their hands, saw what mercy actually costs, decided it was too dangerous to leave lying around the house, and scraped it off. And Augustine, the man who stood up to defend it, had lived 15 years with a woman he never married and had a son by her. The one who fought hardest to keep this story in the Bible knew precisely which side of that courtyard he belonged on. Then the noise stops. Every accuser is gone. The crowd is still sitting on the stones, and in the middle of that pavement there are 2 people left. Augustine described what remained in 2 Latin words, miseria et misericordia, misery and mercy, the wretched one and the one who is merciful. Jesus stands up and asks her where they went. Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. And the only man in that courtyard with a clean hand, the only man in Jerusalem qualified under his own ruling to lift the first stone, is holding nothing. He tells her he does not condemn her either. Go and sin no more. Both halves of that. He does not pretend nothing happened, and he does not hand her over. She walks out of the temple court alive, and the men who dragged her there are already gone. 3 things to carry out of this. First, Jesus never suspended the law of Moses that morning. He enforced it. He asked for the full statute, including the clause about the witnesses throwing first, and the full statute is what cleared the courtyard. Mercy arrived because the standard was finally applied to every man in the room. Second, the men who knew Scripture best were the first ones out. The elders, the men with 50 years of the prophets behind them. All that study did not protect them from that moment. It is what made them see it coming before anyone else in the courtyard did. The more you actually know about God, the harder it gets to stand in a circle pretending your own hands are clean. Third, and this is the one to sit with, the one man in that courtyard who was qualified to throw refused to throw. And he wrote what he wrote in dust, on the one surface in Jerusalem that a gust of wind erases. 40 years later, Roman soldiers tore that temple down, and the courtyard was plowed under, and every mark anyone ever made in that dust went with it. That was the point. He put their names in the one place where nothing stays. So here is my question for you. If he knelt down in front of you today and wrote one line in the dirt, what do you think it would say? Tell me in the comments. I read them. He could have written on stone. He had done it before, on a mountain, with his own finger, in letters that lasted. That morning he chose dust.